What's going on, y'all? KM here from the undisclosed location. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I've said it a million times. I personally believe that Goon Knight is the best deck in the game right now. As of right now, after my last video, it now has a total of 650 games played in top 10% Infinite on untap.gg, which is about a 1.5% increase, and its win rate is still the highest of any deck that has a played games of more than 100 at that rank. I consider it the best deck in the game. My stats with it have been out of the park, and while I understand that my stats in some way contribute to that untap.gg number, and that the fact that the people that watch me are probably generally pretty plugged in and competitive, and that also contributes to that number, I do think at this point it is very fair to say that this is probably the best deck in the game, although it is still not the most played deck in the game. I consider it a very real threat that has a lot of disruptive ability and a lot of power. This is a deck that effectively got about a 213 added to it, and that 213 is extremely strong. It is also a deck that it is in a very favored metagame for it. This is a deck that beats up on Arishem decks. This is a deck that beats up on Wiccan decks. This is a deck that beats up on Anti-Venom decks, because all of those decks are playing a lot of big guys that have even costs. And when you play a lot of big guys that have even costs, Fenris Goon Knight is about as good as you can do against decks like that. The Arishem matchup is particularly notable. I know people like to act like that deck is uncounterable because of all the randomness. This is like a 70-30 into Arishem. You're gonna bully them a lot. It's very, very strong. This move bounce list came to me by way of Sizer, and it has been my favorite move bounce list to play. What I will say, though, is that actually playing this deck legitimately hurts my brain. It's very difficult to play. The power output is massive. What Sizer has done here is remove Falcon in order to get US Agent in here, which is reflective of the same metagame trends that make Goon Knight so relevant right now. These big 4s and 6s that people are playing are a very large part of the metagame, and US Agent is extremely powerful into the group of those as a whole. And having a card like that can be a threat on its own can help to alleviate some of the issues this deck has where it just doesn't draw enough threats, where you're looking at like just one lane or just one move card that you have in order to win one lane. We also have Frigga in order to try to alleviate that. But generally speaking, if you're missing one card out of here and it's like one of the expensive ones, you can look at replacements like Anti-Venom and like getting the Falcon back in. Both of those are acceptable as far as budget replacements go. Also, I will note, I said Anti-Venom, I meant Agent Venom. It honestly probably won't be the first time I mess that up, and I know it's not going to be the last. Speaking of messing up, you may notice I messed up that last sentence, and also you're gonna mess up when you play this. I cannot stress enough how hard it is to properly sequence, how many times you're gonna trip over yourself when you play a deck like this. The ways in which Frigga and Doctor Strange and Ghost Spider sort of run into each other are not intuitive. They all trigger on the last thing played, but you'll still like brain fart sometimes and like try to do something with a move card that requires a Ghost Spider or Doctor Strange and then copy the Ghost Spider and Doctor Strange by mistake. Tons of easy mistakes to make in this deck. There's a lot of stuff to pay attention to, but the power output is generally, in my opinion, pretty close to unmatched. Jumping off of the move sub-theme here, we are going to talk about the larger move deck, and it is still what you remember it being. The main upside of a deck like this is the massive battlefield control that you have. You have the ability to move a Cosmo, you have the ability to play Eliath, you have the ability to create the absolute most dangerous 50-50s in the entire game. This deck, to me, is a factory of guessing games. It is one of the least enjoyable experiences to play with and against, in my opinion, because so much of this deck is will they, won't they? There's will they, won't they move the Cosmo? Will they, won't they move something else that adds power to the card that they moved, like a Vulture or a Dagger? Will that power be enough? Will they, won't they play another thing that moves it afterwards? Will they, won't they Eliath or Heimdall? It's a lot of just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, and then outputting points and hoping that it works. And I think that ultimately, I feel as though a deck like this is quite difficult to play, quite difficult to play against, and skill expression does exist within that, but it's very much the kind of skill expression that's like, okay, I've played this person 5 times, I'm going to try to make a read on them, rather than the kind of skill expression that can be used on the wider ladder. Because on the wider ladder, it's like, all right, your opponent played around the right thing, I guess there's nothing you can do about that. One thing I will note is that people playing Heimdall, you should be a little cautious of that. A lot of people, when playing around this deck, will like very explicitly play around the Heimdall and choose to do that because this deck is so known to play that card. So please be aware, unless he's like really winning a location, things like that. There are going to be people who are just like, I'm setting up to beat Heimdall specifically on turn 6. I said it last time, I'll say it again, normal bounce is underrated. There are a lot of powerful things that this deck does, and it can take the fight to any of the mid-range decks in the game. It does not have good or meaningful targets for Moon Knight to hit. Most of anything that's good in this deck is going to cost 3 or 1. None of the things that get hit really even disrupt you all that much because of how much redundancy you have. The power output is very high. If you put it together, the numbers are very big. You can outpower most of the mid-range decks, and that will be your goal. Your goal is to consistently put power on the board, and the upside of this deck compared to Move Bounce is it's much easier to play and it falls apart way less. So if you like high success rate, this is the deck for you. Now it's time to talk about the incredibly vast world of mid-range piles. I believe we're going to talk about 5 decks in this section, and the thing that I'm using to group them together is the combination of being either a Wiccan deck or an Anti-Venom deck. These decks are fundamentally trying to do mostly similar things. They're trying to output points, have some good interaction, and cheat on energy, and all of them are sort of similarly positioned right now. These are all a group of decks that you're going to see a lot of, and you're going to see variations on the ones that I'm talking about here, because hey, I'm talking about 5, but there's actually honestly more like 15. This could be its own tier list, honestly, where we just talk about all the 75 different configurations of mid-range decks. Here, we're going to start with the one that I have enjoyed the most recently. This is Dopest Body's list, where it's just a straight-up normal Wiccan deck, playing just unexpected threats in the form of Gore at the top end, and of course, Eliath. Every one of these cards is probably replaceable, like not Wiccan, obviously, but like the Daredevil Negasonic package, the Fenris Wolf Gladiator package, all of that stuff can go in and out. You can go back to the Surtur, you can bring in a speed. When you bring in the Surtur, you're going to want to bring in the Arrow and the Magneto again. It's really just the baseline shell here with packages going in and out depending on what you feel like doing. I have enjoyed the Fenris Wolf package. I have enjoyed the Daredevil package. This is kind of the deck I play when I get tilted because it's just so consistent with its output. I very much enjoyed how it's looked and how it's played, but there are 75 variants of Quicksilver Wiccan at this point, and it's really just about subbing packages in and out. Think about a card and the cards that go with it. Take out the ones you don't like, put in the ones you do like. As an example, here is one using the Toxic package and the Fenris Wolf package. It's not that hard to mix and match packages here. The Toxic package is probably the biggest of these packages, but it's not like the Surtur package isn't fairly sizable on its own. But again, it's super straightforward. If you wanted to get really greedy with this, you could try getting an Anti-Venom in here instead of the Shang-Chi. A lot of people, myself included, are pretty high on Shang-Chi right now, especially when you have Red Guardian to deal with those armors out of Surtur decks, who we will be covering in just a little bit. As always, though, it's about the packages you want and the packages that you don't. This deck has opted for the Affliction, which is very reasonably priced right now. As far as I'm concerned, it's a good investment. But if more loot cages start showing up, you are in trouble. And that has always been the problem with this deck, is if you run into an Anti-Venom loot cage deck, you kind of get run over. Like this, for example. I think a lot of the time, people who are not fans of Marvel Snap's monetization tend to boil decks down to, wow, it's like 4 of the last 8 cards released. I can't afford any of this. But I think if any deck deserves getting treated like that, it's probably this deck. We could have even gotten greedier with it, not in terms of like anything else, but I mean like literally, and gone like Cable for Fenris Wolf and gotten even more pay to win if we felt like doing that. The Anti-Venom decks are just very straightforward, excellent mid-range points packages. Gorr is an easy slot in here as basically a high roll, but I will say that I haven't been the biggest fan of him on his own in these packages. There's other builds of this deck that I've seen that are also using things like Ravonna, and they're using things like Sage, and trying to do double up on Gorr with Mystique and things of that nature. I think that's also very, very solid. This deck is still trying to maintain the identity of being a sort of alt version of Sarah Tech, basically. That's really what this deck is. It's using Anti-Venom to cheat instead of Sarah, but it is pretty much similar, and Gorr is excellent with Anti-Venom, not just because if you hit Gorr with the Anti-Venom, it's very good, but also because hitting something else with the Anti-Venom allows you to play another card alongside your 6-drop, which is very important when you're only contesting one lane with the Gorr. Here's an example of an Anti-Venom deck making a higher investment in Gorr. I am not sure how worth it that investment actually is. I think it's pretty reasonable in terms of investment, but I'm not sure you're getting what you're getting out an equivalent value of what you're putting in. Honestly, when I've played this deck, it's felt strong. Like, it's very hard for like a Hydra Bob Anti-Venom Malekith deck to feel not strong, but it's hard for me to tell if there's a real advantage to this deck unless you're hitting the Iron Man, unless you're hitting the Gorr, and even then, I'm not entirely sure how well, or not well, I should say, it compares to something like Ronan the Accuser. There are some big Gorrs, but there are absolutely matchups where Gorr is going to be like 5 or 7, and when that happens, your deck isn't functioning, and you're just like, oh, well, I have this ability to double up the Gorr, but it's not really going to be that big. Even when it's like 11, that's like not that big. Like the Hulk is 12. Like, what are we going out of our way for 11 for? And so I think this deck has some juice, and you'll definitely see it, but I default towards enjoying the Pile of Peck version just a little bit more. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is one of 2 decks that I would describe as the most underrated in the game. I think among good players are really high on move bounce already. I don't really think I can call that underrated. I don't think I can call Goon Knight underrated after I did the video on it. Ronan Anti-Venom is just strong. It is just a strong deck, and I think it goes to demonstrate exactly what the metagame calls for and why it can be different from just running all good cards, right? Ronan is like not a classic good card. It's just a little bit worse than the typical things that other 5s are showing up there. But it's very good with Mystique. It's very consistent without Mystique. And there's no like super low rolls on this deck where you're like, well, I guess I just lose because my Gorr is 5. This card is going to be bigger than Gorr a lot of the time. It's going to be smaller than Gorr a lot of the time. But the major thing that you get out of this is that it does cost 5. And being able to cost 5 makes your whole deck more consistent. When you look at the other Gorr decks, especially the one with Mystique, in order to actually get value out of that Mystique, you need to get the Gorr down on turn 5. Which means when that doesn't happen, it's just not a card. And so this deck is able to execute its game plan far more consistently, even if it's giving up a little bit of that power that happens when you hit an Anti-Venom with that Gorr. It's just like absolutely unbelievably incredible. That is an incredible high roll, but I really do think that this deck is straight up underrated in terms of how it impacts this stuff. Here's underrated deck number 2. I think a lot of people don't have a ton of respect for discard, and I understand why. Like, there is a pretty defined weakness to Red Guardians that can make the snaps a little bit awkward, but this deck puts power on the board in a very powerful way, and I think it has good matchups into things like Arishem, where it can just try to nut off, and there's not a lot of disruption that Arishem decks have. It has good matchups into various other lists that are looking to be sort of mid-range beaters. It can go power for power with most mid-range decks in the game, with the only real negative coming when they hit your Dracula with a Red Guardian. That's really the thing that you're the most afraid of. But on numbers, you can absolutely compete, especially when you're drawing right against basically everything in the game. The ability to have these Gambit Grandmaster things in here really does drag the deck a lot closer to other of those mid-range decks that we just talked about in terms of power output. because they're not putting that many cards on the board, and so blowing up one card is actually just very, very useful. This deck also has an extremely good matchup into Goon Knight, which is very relevant right now. Obviously, it can be bad, but you have so many ways of making their Moon Knight just look incredibly stupid and making them look stupid for even trying to play a deck that is leveraging discarding your opponent's cards. I think it's well positioned and fundamentally strong, and this is a good moment for discard. If you like putting yourself and your opponents to sleep and playing the easiest but still potentially the strongest for the level of ease deck that you can get, this is the deck for you. Surtur is sort of the opposite of Move Bounce, where Move Bounce is extremely difficult to play, very mentally taxing, and has a massive potential point output that is very hard to calculate. Surtur is not mentally taxing at all, has a very predictable point output, but it's just straight up good enough. This deck is excellent. Now, there is still one major thing that I worry about when it comes to like how it's actually being put together, and it's how do I get Juggernaut into this list? That's what's so difficult for me right now. I want 3/1s because I would like to be able to play the card Cull Obsidian, but I also want to play Juggernaut because so many of the best final turn plays are things like playing a Scar and playing a Juggernaut. That's your best final turn a lot of the time, unless you're really nutting off with like actual free scars and stuff like that. This deck is powerful, it is potent, it has great numbers, but I do worry without the Juggernaut, which I think you can replace for Cosmo, but then you have like the ability to get Shang-Chi'd again. The deck wants one more slot, basically. And I talked about this last week, but this deck desperately wants one more slot. It wants to be able to play 13 cards so it can fit that card back in. And if it could do that, it would be an amazing, amazing choice. But it can't do that, so it has to make a sacrifice somewhere. And that's hard. You either sacrifice a 1-drop and play Cull Obsidian less, or you sacrifice a Cosmo and get Shang-Chi a little bit more, or you sacrifice the Juggernaut and then don't have Juggernaut. And I think it's just all around kind of a tough situation. But the deck is still very good at outputting points. You can honestly snap a lot of hands because you know that you have like, hey, I've got Surtur, I've got some other stuff, it's going to be fine, I'm getting a big guy. It's very hard to stay into this deck when they have the ability to play Scar, and even if you don't get the Scar, it's like they're probably going to end up leaving a lot of the time. On to the big deck portion of our video. Now, we're going to start with base Arishem. Base Arishem is, in my opinion, the best of the big deck decks, and that is because I think it has a much more clearly defined role in the metagame compared to several other things that could be reasonable, but fundamentally are not necessarily going to make you win in the same way. This is, in my opinion, the most well-rounded of these decks, and the one that does it the best at doing its job, which is to say, beating up mid-range decks, which is why we've gone back to the Loki, which is why we've gone back to the Quinjet. All we're trying to do is cheat as hard as possible and go toe-to-toe with all of these Anti-Venom decks, all of these Wiccan decks. That's what we're trying to beat with this list. And a lot of the time, we're just trying to stomp on anyone who isn't playing anything up to par that is in a similar vein to those decks. This deck gets a lot of free wins. I think it's sort of like the metagame police, because if you're playing something that's just like, oh, I'm just testing this out, it's kind of mid, I don't really know where it fits, you're going to get run over by Arishem a lot of the time. And I think that's sort of another reason why people don't like it very much. This is the Thanos list I've been playing. I am a bit suspicious of it. It's been putting up good numbers in top 10% Infinite, and I haven't found a better pure Thanos list, but I worry that that might just mean that pure Thanos is not really where I want to be. Pure Thanos is definitely a deck that I enjoy. I just don't exactly know if it's up to snuff in this current metagame. I've also seen, of course, Pure Thanos with Surtur, which I think is totally valid and fine. It has very, very, very strong draws when it has those draws. Something like doing an early Mind Stone into actually having your Surtur draw is a stronger nut draw than the Surtur deck itself, and that is a relevant thing to have access to. One thing I do want to point out, though, is Gorr is quite strong in Thanos decks. Again, the deck likes running downhill, so when you're not running downhill, your Gorr is bad, your Mockingbird is bad, so you can't stay in those games. It doesn't have a lot of comeback potential, but the deck does have a lot of ability to snowball downhill once you start getting those stones onto the board. between Gore and Mockingbird, you're just going to kind of dominate a lot of games. You can also play Surtur, Thanoshem, and I think there is a point at which deck building mostly ceases to matter. And I'm not sure this deck has hit that point. It's definitely an awkward kind of thing to try to deal with. This is a very, very, very powerful deck. It has a lot of upsides in terms of what it is able to bring to bear, but fundamentally what you're doing is you're leveraging your randomness here. You have a lot of cards in your deck. They're all very good cards. You're leveraging your extra energy. You're leveraging your Thanos stuff. You're trying to cheat. This deck tries to cheat harder than anything. It's a great mid-range buster, and I think that that is the role that you're going to want to try to play, but I'm not sure it's a consistent enough mid-range buster to be better than normal Arishem. Next up is Husky Pile, named after, of course, husky puppies. This is a powerful deck that looks like a mid-range deck, but really plays a little bit more like one of the bounce decks in terms of what it's trying to do against other people. The deck is effectively trying to have massive final turns, whether those final turns are something like the nut draw of you have 8 energy, you have a War Machine, you play the Infinite, you play all your free ones because they're all free because you Black Swanned, and you also have a Shadow King. Or you're doing something much more normal, which is just like, oh, I'm going to like blink into the Infinite, it's going to be very big, I'm going to have a normal turn 6 that's like pretty large. The point of this deck is basically that it looks like a mid-range deck, but plays, honestly, a little bit closer to like Mr. Negative. It's a deck that is looking to do something extreme, but it is also a lot more consistent at doing something messed up. Obviously, this is a deck that cares a lot about Electro. All of your best draws are things like Electro Misery, Electro Blink. Those are your really powerful things that you're trying to do, but a lot of stuff can happen with this deck, and the power range is so wide because you kind of always know what's going to be relevant to be able to pull out of Blink. They don't know what's going to be relevant to be able to pull out of Blink. Things like that. You are able to leverage that hidden information very powerfully, and your fundamental point output is very, very large when you're pulling off what you're trying to pull off with the deck. Moon Girl is a pretty damn solid deck. I think it's actually one of the decks that is the easiest to play once you get the hang of it. If you're not interested in all of the big brain stuff in Bounce, in all of the big brain stuff in Move Bounce, or even the big brain stuff in the Husky deck we just talked about, and you just want a deck where like figuring out what you're going to do is as simple as saying, well, how many points is this going to be? You want to play this deck. This is a straightforward and powerful deck with immense point potential, but it's really more about the games where you aren't nut drawing when it comes to making this deck good. Having things like 1/9 Hydra Bobs, 1/9 Titanias, cloning stuff like that, that can be better a lot of the time than sitting on a She-Hulk and making sure that it gets to 0. You have hand management exercises that you can do in order to make sure your Moon Girls are hitting the right thing. But honestly, a lot of it is just, what is my turn 6 play going to be? And then work backwards from there and create the situation that allows you to make that your turn 6 play. And that is, I think, not only just an easy deck to play, but a rewarding thought process to plug yourself into. And I think this is the kind of deck that will teach you things about the game. If someone came to me and were like, I want to be better at Marvel Snap, what deck should I play? I think Moon Girl will teach you a lot. It'll teach you about point allocation, it'll teach you about sequencing, but fundamentally it teaches those things on a pretty basic level. And so I think that is a really big upside of a deck like this. It's quite strong, but it's also teaching you to be better in a real way. Scream is Scream. Even in the heaviest of energy cheating environments, which we're definitely in right now, this deck just has enough juice to compete when it draws the cards it wants to draw. It's got a lot of power because of course, the card Scream. It's got a lot of disruptive ability. I had a game where I played Moon Girl and they moved my Hope Summers every turn and I never got any energy off of it. Like, it's definitely the kind of thing that can mess with you for sure. This ability to be unpredictable at the top end with the Iron Man and the Heimdall is unique and interesting, although I think it's far from required. You could very easily go back to, Magneto and something else there, and I wouldn't be like, oh my god, how could you do that? It's just fun. I think that ultimately what keeps this deck competitive is all the cards that cost less than 5. The stuff that costs 5 and 6, that's gravy. You can kind of do whatever you want there. But it's really about the core of stuff that costs 2 and 3 mostly. And then, of course, Miles and Stegron, which are pretty solid as well. That's what makes this deck work. That's the meat here. And I like what it does. I like the cards that it is able to bring to bear. But you do really want to scream. It's really important to get that scream. Classic Clog, with the addition of Fenris Wolf, gets some more beef. Like, you have Fenris Wolf, you have a Shang-Chi. It's pretty straightforward, right? You can see where this is going. You're basically trying to say you're Shang-Chi. It's actually 2 Shang-Chis. And Classic Clog is very good at setting up situations where it is, winning one lane and then wins another lane with a big guy. This is another chance at getting a big guy. It's also another chance at destroying one of your opponent's big guys with the Shang-Chi, getting the big guy. You kind of see where this is going. Clog is Clog. You've probably played this before. The, of course, turn 4 Titania Green Goblin that everyone hates. It's still quite good to do that, actually. I'll have you know. There's not as much interaction with the sort of onboard locations as there has been previously. Magic is a little safer now than when everyone was playing Thanoshem or when everyone was playing Legion and Anti-Venom. The diversity of Anti-Venom lists has sort of made Legion get less play. There are still Legions in various like Arishem Thanos decks or even just Arishem decks that you are going to have to be aware of. But there's really only a couple matchups where there's like meaningful location control right now, and you should be able to deal with those as is necessary. Thanos especially, it's like, okay, you have location control, but also you play so much crap that I'm probably going to beat you regardless. It doesn't really matter if you blow that up. And so it's okay, I think, in terms of dealing with what beats it when it comes to Magic. Longtime viewers of the channel will know that I maybe have a vendetta against Mill. No, I just think that, like, normally Mill is kind of bad. There's not really a good reason to be a Mill deck as opposed to any other form of disruption. All the other forms of disruption tend to be better and have better payoffs and be more meaningful. So why the hell is Mill here? Am I doing another don't play this deck? Not exactly, because there actually is a reason to be a Mill deck now, and it's I really want to take a huge shit on the card Anti-Venom. If you want to take a huge shit on the card Anti-Venom, Mill's really good at that. Like, Mill is really good at that. Oh, they Anti-Venomed? I guess I don't have priority, so on their turn 4, I'll play Baron Zemo. Thanks for the card that you Anti-Venomed there. It's rude. as an Anti-Venom player, it's rude. It's not fun. Like, you kind of need your cards in your deck in order for them to get discounted. It sucks. And so you really actually have a use case for this, where previously Mill just had no use case and people did it just to do it. There's a real reason to try it now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. Oh, God, I said it again. I swore I wasn't going to say making it through anymore. I talked about this at the end of the last, 2 videos. Thank you so much for watching that video. If you'd like to subscribe and support the channel further, that would be incredible for me. Every little bit of support helps. Of course, thank you so much. As always, I also have a Metafy if people want to contribute and make me do stupid stuff. I know they've been raising the prices to subscribe on some other platforms that will go unnamed. So if you want to check that out, it's linked in the description. Thanks so much.